In combat sports such as MMA, there is no universal best style that suits everyone equally. Everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses, and furthermore, there is a counter for every advantage. This is what makes it such a great sport to watch. In this video, however, we will go through the styles in terms of physical capacity, such as strength, power, and endurance. The most common types of fighters in this regard is the somewhat slow and sloppy fighter but with a gas tank for days, that durability, the twitchy and snappy and explosive power freak who is prone to fatigue, and the in-between fighter with a good balance of all of the attributes, the hybrid fighter so to speak. Now, athletic qualities such as strength, power and endurance, they are based on many different factors. To name a few, we have aerobic capacity, anaerobic capacity, neuromuscular factors, anatomy, psychological factors, the list goes on. And trying to make sense of all of those factors and their relative contribution when it comes to athleticism is a very difficult task. Let's not get into that. There is, however, one very detrimental parameter that determines your athleticism to a very significant extent. And that is your muscle fiber type composition, the distribution that is. Generally speaking, we have three different types of muscle fibers. We have the type 1 muscle fibers that are low in power but are very resistant to fatigue. We have the type 2A, which are moderately powerful and still endurant, but not to the same extent as type 1. And then we have the type 2X that are very powerful, twitchy and snappy and explosive, but they tire out quickly. As this video goes on, you're gonna start to notice a pattern here. If we were to take a look at the types of fibers under a microscope, you would notice that they have different colors. And as you can see, there is no extremes, it's all in spectrums. The terms type 1, type 2A and type 2X, they are simply generalizations of those spectrums. The darker muscle fibers, they are rich in myoglobin because they have to transport oxygen to the musculature, so they are rich in blood content and they therefore have the darker color. The lighter ones, however, they are not dependent on aerobic metabolism and they are more twitchy and explosive, which the oxygen will not have enough time to reach your musculature, so they are lighter in color. And the type 2A fibers, they are somewhere in between. And this begs the obvious question, can muscle fiber types be changed? For example, can you change from fast twitch to slow twitch? And can you change them within their own categories, etc.? This is a very debated topic in the scientific community. Some are for it, some aren't. Some say it can't happen at all, that it's set in stone, others say it can only happen within their own categories, for example, type 2A to type 2X, but not type 2 fiber to a type 1 fiber and vice versa. Sadly, as of now, we have very limited evidence for either argument. With that being said, here is a brief description of every single muscle fiber type. You can pause this picture and go through it. Now you have to note that every single athlete will possess all of the types, both slow twitch and fast twitch. However, it is the proportion of them that differs. When it comes to the proportion of fast twitch and slow twitch, it can vary dramatically from athlete to athlete. It can be a 50-50 kind of thing, 80-20, 90-10. It varies. One very interesting study, they basically took a biopsy of 270 healthy inactive people and 148 physically active people, and they found out that the proportion of fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers can vary between 15 to 85% in individuals, and this to a certain extent explains why athletic qualities vary so much as well. Once again, before we proceed, athleticism is a very complex issue, as is muscle fibers. This thing is dependent on many factors, and this video will only give you a generalized description of the concepts. With that being said, let's divide fighters into three categories: type 1 fighters, type 2A fighters, and type 2X fighters. Let's begin with the type 1 fighter. This fighter is characterized by their durability, their gas tank. Typically they are a bit sluggish in their execution, but they can last for days and they will often wear their opponents down with volume. Oftentimes they look a bit slender in build, they are not so muscular often, and this is no surprise because type 1 fibers, they have a smaller cross-sectional area and they are generally not very prone to muscular hypertrophy. And after a match, when you look at them, when you look at their demeanor, they often appear to be in good enough shape for many other rounds, whereas their opponents will often look completely done. So what are some advantages of being a type 1 fighter? You can sustain prolonged defensive and offensive maneuvers in high quantities without getting fatigued easily. You have a high potential for developing your oxidative system, that is the aerobic system, and you can recover quickly between rounds. And typically you will thrive in the later rounds because of your gas tank. Disadvantages. They have a relatively low strength and power output compared to other types because of their slow twitch muscle fibers. And oftentimes they display low speed, they are not very rapid. They are prone to getting overpowered by the fast twitch fighters in the early rounds, so this is where they most probably have to be the most careful. So what are some common strategies that the Type 1 fighter will use? High volume of semi-powerful offensive maneuvers from start to finish. They will just suffocate the opponent and pick them apart with seemingly what appears to be not so powerful strikes, but it is the volume that does the damage. The opponent will suffer slowly and surely. Another strategy that they might adopt is to conserve the energy early on and remain defensive, avoid unnecessary exertion. Even though they could go on because of their volume capacity, they will later thrive in the later rounds, whereas the fast switch opponent will most likely be fatigued, and this is where they shine. So, what are some examples of Type 1 fighters? We have Colby Covington, Nate Diaz, and of course, Max Holloway. So what would be the dream scenario for a Type 1 fighter if they could have it their way? You guessed it, one infinite round, unlimited time. This is where the Type 1 fighter would shine. However, now that there is a time limit in MMA matches, there are some training interventions that would be suitable for a Type 1 fighter, and one of those would be to emphasize strength and power training. This is likely where the margin of improvement would be the highest. Another would be to still maintain the aerobic tank, don't disregard it altogether. You're simply shifting your focus on a while on other attributes where you could develop more, where your margin of improvement is high. Now, time to go through the Type 2A fighter, one of my personal favorites. Type 2A muscle fibers are generally known as fast oxidative glycolytic. This essentially means that they are a hybrid between aerobic and anaerobic, the muscle fibers that is, which is what MMA basically demands predominantly. It's a mix. They will not only be able to display great levels of endurance, but also do it with a high power output. This often makes them a nightmare to face as an opponent. Usually it's very polarized, either you're very fast twitch or you're very endurant and weak, but those fighters, they lie somewhere in between. And typically the strategy they adopt, although not necessarily, is that they are on their opponent's faces from start to finish, giving them a barrage of powerful actions in an interval-like fashion. First they go light and medium, and then they go super powerful, and they shift like this in an interval fashion. You will rarely see those fighters being on the back foot. They do it all, boxing, wrestling, all in offensive maneuvers in an interval fashion. So their advantages, as we briefly went through, they are very balanced in attributes in terms of strength, power and endurance. And they can therefore adopt many strategies due to their versatility. They can adopt a powerful strategy against one opponent, they can be more endurant towards another opponent, the possibilities are endless. And once again, their ability to sustain semi-powerful or pretty powerful actions for a prolonged period of time, this is a very big advantage if you, for example, are a wrestler or a pressure fighter, for example. And note, it's powerful actions that we're talking about. But of course, life isn't sunshine and rainbows, everyone has their challenges. Due to being very balanced in attributes, they may prove vulnerable to other extremes at certain points of the fights. That is to say, fast twitch fighters in the early rounds and slow twitch fighters in the later rounds. So, balance is everything for this type of fighter. And what are some common strategies that they will adopt? Like we went to earlier, they are highly adaptable and they can resort to many strategies due to their hybrid qualities. Although all styles can tailor a plan for a certain opponent, this is especially pronounced for Type 2A fighters. And since they possess high anaerobic endurance, the powerful endurance, they can perform their actions in interval style formats like we talked about. Low effort but voluminous activities followed by bursts of high intensity activities at the right times. Let's play a little game this time. Pause this video right now and try to guess who I'm about to mention. Ready? Let's go. Number 1, the man himself, Khabib Nurmagomedov. Number 2, Alexander Volkanovski, a real physical freak. And number 3, the good old George St. Pierre. So what are some training interventions for the Type 2A fighter? Because they are hybrid fighters, they in turn need a hybrid approach as well. They must emphasize all athletic qualities with almost equal importance. And once again, every type of fighter needs to do this, but this is especially pronounced for this type of fighter. And this can of course be done with a periodization strategy, which involves concentrating on one specific athletic quality during one period of time and then shifting your focus to another at a later stage. This is Strength and Conditioning 101. I have made a lot of videos about this, check them out if you want to. Now it's time for the Type 2X fighter. And I think you can guess yourself what the attributes are. Due to having such a high proportion of fast twitch muscle fibers, those fighters, they will often possess one of the most fair attributes in combat sports, knockout power. And occasionally you will see them display ridiculous feats of strength and power, even with seemingly less than optimal technique, like they will muscle through submission attempts or takedowns, which a wrestling coach would shiver when they see. And since Type 2X fighters have the largest cross-sectional area and are most prone to hypertrophy, those fighters will typically appear very muscular, and this adds another fear factor that they will utilize in their game plans. So, what are some advantages that they possess? Number 1, obviously power and strength. Those fighters, they will not only be able to deliver their actions quicker, but with a lot more force, because fast twitch muscle fibers, they have more contractile properties and higher twitch. And image. Due to their power output and consequently their knockout power, they will consciously or unconsciously spread fear and gain an advantage in the emotional realm. A highly compensatory attribute. This is quite a... It bugs me, of course, and it should bug everyone else, but power to a certain extent, it can partially compensate for deficiencies in other areas, such as training experience and lacks in skill. Of course, other attributes such as endurance and things like this can do it as well, but history has shown like a lot of those power freaks, they can get away with limited training experience and they can still make it. This is an attribute, a very powerful attribute, but of course it's not everything. You need to do everything else as well that a fighter demands. It's like a clockwork, but this attribute itself, if you use it correctly, there is a high advantage in it. But of course, even they have their disadvantages. Even though you're a power freak, you look intimidating, all of that, you have your weak points. And number 1, you guessed it, they are prone to fatigue, especially in terms of aerobic metabolism. Power demands a lot of energy, especially anaerobic power, and if you're predominantly fast twitch, your muscles, they have limited capacity to transport oxygen to the musculature. And typically they require a longer time to recover between powerful bursts and between rounds even, once again because their aerobic system is susceptible. And this is a very interesting point, they are very prone to over-reliance on their power, and in severe cases this develops into overconfidence. Once again, this is an attribute, a very powerful attribute, and it can lead to just getting hyperinflated of your own abilities, and we have seen this tons, time and time again in all combat sports, boxing and MMA, over-reliance and overconfidence due to having such a gift. Common strategies. Number 1, spreading fear and resorting to psychological manipulation. If you watch those types of fighters, almost all of them resort to this in some form or another. Because of this attribute once again, and because they are so muscular, they often have an intimidating appearance. They have an advantage in this realm, and generally it works. Like, fighting is a sport that is primarily based on skill, yes, but look and intimidation, such factors, they affect the outcome as well. And knowing that they have a vulnerable gas tank, they will often opt to finish the fight early on. We have seen this time and time again with those type of fighters. And this is probably their most important strategy, strategic pacing, which is conserving energy to go for explosive bursts in the right moments, not getting too crazy, that is. Now here are some examples of fighters that I would categorize as type 2X. Conor McGregor. You can say what you want about him, but he is super explosive and fast twitch and he hits like a truck. Number 2, Francis Ngannou, of course. If you watch his fight against Stipe Miocic, you could see some of the mistakes he did in the first fight and the adjustments he did in the second that we have went through already. And number 3, rest in peace, Anthony Johnson. So what would a dream scenario be for a type 2X fighter? A short round. One round of say 60 seconds, then they could go all out, go crazy and hopefully get the knockout or finish the fight early on due to their overpowering capacity. But that's obviously not how it works, and even they have their own special training interventions that they need to follow. And like all other types, they need to work on all aspects of training, perhaps with a special emphasis on conditioning since that's their weak point. But there is one very important parameter that they have to emphasize especially, and that is patience. By having the gift of power, one is very prone to being eager and trying to finish the fight early on and display their attributes. They must work under a competent coach and strategically aware coach that will teach them how to conserve themselves at the right time and when to let the cannon go. Once again, if you want to see this performed into perfection, watch the 2 different fights between Francis Ngannou and Stipe Miocic, the difference between those 2. And once again, I do want to mention that athletic qualities is a complex task. This was merely a generalized explanation of everything. There is many other factors that will amount to your or account for your athleticism. See this just as a thought experiment, a fun video, take it with a pinch of salt, and I hope you learned something. Once again, I do want to mention that I offer personalized coaching for elite athletes, or if you see this sport as a hobby. Strength and power training, endurance training, and I educate you and I become your mentor on every aspect. I work with elite athletes from all over the world, in all countries, of all sports, mostly combat athletes though. I also have training programs, just visit my website. Thank you for watching.